Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It is such an incredible honor to be here. I am so humbled to be in the presence, thank you so much, of such righteous women. And I want to thank Hannah. You are the hardest act to follow, I have to say. You are a mentor, a hero to me, and I'm just so honored to have been invited to address everybody here today. I also want to congratulate all the honorees. I was so moved by the story of your family. I'm also very happy to be joined today by my mother-in-law, Barbara Silverman, my sister-in-law, Marissa, family, Margaret, and of course, my mother, Ellen Goldstein. My mother is the greatest role model in my life. She has supported me throughout whatever I do, and no doubt being a Jewish advocate, being a pro-Israel advocate is hard. It's very hard. And if it wasn't for the support of my family and of my mother and father, I do not think that I would be standing here today. I also want to mention that from really as long as I could remember when I was a little girl, my mother was very involved. They called it Hadassah WIZO in Toronto. She served on the board. It's WIZO. WIZO it is, always. And they would do bazaars, not as high-end as this, but it was so much fun to go with my mom and to be at a stall, and she really taught me that public service was fun and was rewarding. And so I thank you, Mommy, for always bringing me every year to WIZO Bazaars and for encouraging me to dedicate my life to the service of Am Yisrael and the Jewish people. So, as was mentioned before, when I was actually in my second year of law school, I ended up producing a documentary film called The Making of a Martyr. And that film went on to win the Audience Choice Award for Best Film at the United Nations Documentary Film Festival in 2006. I was 25 years old. And for the 2 years prior to that, at great personal risk, I spent 2 years going into the so-called Palestinian territories, otherwise known as Judea, Samaria, and I interviewed leaders of terrorist organizations, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. I went into Israeli prisons. I interviewed children who had been used for terrorist attacks. I interviewed the families of suicide bombers. I went into kindergartens run by terrorists like Islamic Jihad. And I did so to expose what I thought was the number one greatest crime against humanity occurring now, which is the illegal, state-sponsored indoctrination and recruitment of innocent Muslim children towards violence. A lot of people say, oh, we have to end the cycle of hatred and violence in the Middle East. There is no cycle. Hatred is taught. No child is born with hatred in his or her heart. And what I learned filming this movie, which ironically the United Nations gave me an award for because UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, is single-handedly responsible for running schools that literally hire teachers off the Hamas payroll. They invite Al-Qutla al-Islamiyah, which is Hamas's youth wing, into the schools to recruit children to become child soldiers, child suicide bombers, to become human shields. And when I released this movie, and I started advocating and speaking on behalf of the innocent Muslim children who deserve equal protection. None of these children deserve to be taught from infancy, from their school textbooks, by their teachers, by their religious leaders, often by their own parents, to take their own lives for the sake of jihad. This is child abuse. And this is at the center. This is the reason why we have conflict in the Middle East, is because of hate indoctrination and hate education. And when I released my film, after risking my life to expose this human rights abuse, I was called Islamophobic. And I was invited on CNN, I was invited on Fox News, as was mentioned, I went to the Pentagon, the State Department, I turned over 92 hours worth of footage that I had. They made actually a course about it at US CENTCOM, because at that time, Americans didn't understand what is this Islamist terrorism. They didn't understand why people hated us so much that they were willing to take their own lives and the lives of their children. And I was called Islamophobic. And what was crazy to me, and it's still crazy today, that if risking your life to advocate for Muslim children is anti-Islam, what then is pro-Muslim? And isn't that the bigotry of low expectations, the irrationality, as we heard today, of bigotry and anti-Semitism? After I released the film, I noticed that not only were people being slandered, but people started getting sued for exposing terror front groups, charities that operated to fund terrorism. And I ended up working for a litigation defense fund where we provided pro bono representation and financial support to moderate Muslims and to people in the counterterrorism community who were speaking out against Islamist terrorism as a national security threat, but who were then sued in an attempt to shut them up. I represented people like Hassan Diol-Islam, an Iranian American who fled Iran. His family is still there under threat. And he came to this country to talk about NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, or Trita Parsi, who you'll often see on CNN advocating for the Iran deal. Hassan Diol-Islam rightly called them the lobby of the Iranian government. NIAC turned around and sued Hassan Diol-Islam for defamation. We raised thousands of dollars for his defense, and the case was ultimately dropped because not only could NIAC prove that what he was saying, they could not prove that what he was saying was false, but they ended up being sanctioned over $180,000 by the court for an attempt to hide evidence from the court of what their relationship was with the Iranian government. In this work, however, I learned that there were dozens of litigation funds set up to sue pro-Israel advocates, to sue moderate Muslims, and ultimately to paint Israel as a war criminal. You had the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Legal Fund for America. They're working together with Palestine Legal. Now they're working with the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Center for Constitutional Rights. All of these organizations also coordinating and working in parallel with organizations at the United Nations that attempt to paint Israel as a war criminal, file war crimes charges against Israeli officials so they can't cross borders without a fear of an arrest warrant, create special rapporteurs and commissions at the United Nations to go after Israel for so-called war crimes. Right now, one of those commissions, I don't know if you saw, is being headed by a woman, an Italian woman, Francesca Albanese, who went on record stating that Israel has no right to self-defense. This is the person that they head up for the committee. This week, exactly. So I said to myself, well, I have a law degree. I want to work for the pro-Israel litigation fund. How come we are always on the defense? We are the oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history. We deserve equal protection. We deserve civil rights. Our civil rights are being violated on campuses, in the workplace. The highest levels of discrimination, the highest level of hate crimes are against us. And what I found out was that no such fund existed. There was no strategic legal offense aimed at protecting the Jewish community in courts of law around the world. So in 2010, I founded the Lawfare Project. And since then, we have filed over 160 cases around the world. We have recruited over 600 lawyers and 38 law firms. Now, I'm going to tell you really briefly about these cases, and then I want to talk about something else. Oh, yes, of course. One of the greatest cases. This is an incredible story. So we were very fortunate to work with Psagot Winery, which the Phallics are part owners of. And when Europe decided to enact boycott laws, specifically in France, they issued a trade regulation that wine coming from Judea, Samaria, that is produced by Israelis, aka Jews, should be slapped with a label that says product of illegal Israeli colony. No other wine or product from any other territory in the world was treated this way. So we were retained, and we worked with Psagot Winery, and we brought a lawsuit against the French government. And that lawsuit ended up going to the European Court of Justice, which is the Supreme Court of Europe, where there we ended up losing the case. And what was so incredible to me at that point was reading the decision of the European judges. Now, if you have any question as to whether or not systemic racism still exists in Europe, I'm telling you, it's gone nowhere, okay? It is still there. And the decision was so horrific and so disgusting. But what happened was really remarkable, because as a result of the European Court of Justice's decision to say, yes, you can label Jewish and only Jewish products, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo flew for the first official visit ever of a U.S. State Department official to Psagot Winery in Judea, Samaria, and declared that it is U.S. policy that Jews are not illegal in Judea, and that U.S. policy that we will now have everything labeled made in Israel, according to a U.S.-Israel trade agreement. After that, Psagot Winery was sued in Canada by a Jewish person, okay, alleging that the labels were false and misleading. And in Canada, we won. We won on appeal that according to the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, all products under Israeli control are labeled made in Israel. And now we are bringing a lawsuit based on the precedent that we established with the Phallic family, challenging made in Palestine labels as false and misleading, because we know that there no state currently exists called Palestine. It's just a fact, okay? The other lawsuits that we filed, I want to talk about just two more, was San Francisco State University. And this lawsuit is very significant because the issues that we dealt with in this lawsuit are very similar to what's happening across the country. In San Francisco State University, every year they have a student fair where they invite, the week before school starts, all the student groups to table and to recruit people to be a part of their group. Now, Hillel, the only Jewish student organization on San Francisco State University campus, not political, Jewish organization, was denied the right to table. And when Hillel said, well, what's happening here? Why can't we table? They said, well, what is your position on the Israeli occupation? So, of course, Hillel San Francisco wrote an email about how they do not support the Israeli occupation, and yet they were still denied. And also what happened at that campus is the mayor of Jerusalem, then mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, came to speak. And he was shouted down by an angry mob of so-called pro-Palestinian students threatening violence. And it got so bad that the Jewish students had to be escorted out of the room under police protection. And what we found out in the discovery process in this lawsuit is that what the police asked the administrators, the school administrators who were there, who were watching the whole thing, should we stop them? Should we remove the protesters? What should we do? And the school administrator said, no, leave them. They gave them a stand-down order. They told the police not to do anything to protect the Jewish students. But the police went under their own accord and removed the students, like I said, under threat of violence and police protection. And when we sued San Francisco State University, what was so incredible to me is that they admitted, they said, yeah, we didn't let Hillel table. That wasn't an issue of fact that was disputed in the case. They said, we didn't let Hillel Table, not because they're Jewish, but because they're Zionist. And Zionism is a political point of view. And guess what? The California State Anti-Discrimination Act doesn't protect political points of view. It protects race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, national origin, all those protected categories. It doesn't protect your political point of view. We're allowed to discriminate against you. So our response was quite simple. We said, well, number one, who are you to define what our Zionism is? You don't go to a black person and tell them what it's like to be black. You don't go to a woman and undermine her experience if she's experienced any type of, harassment. Who are you to define what Zionism is for us? Zionism is part of my ethnic, cultural, and religious identity. But even if we could disagree, okay? Even if Zionism is merely a political view, as you say, only the Jewish students are given a political litmus test before they're allowed to participate. And that in and of itself is treating Jewish students differently, and that is illegal discrimination under the statute. You don't go to a Muslim student association and say, well, what is your position on Iranian nuclear disarmament? And unless you're a good Muslim, you can't participate here. You don't go to, the black students and say, well, what do you think about the conflict happening in Sudan? But you go only to the Jewish students, and you exclude them based on whether or not you think they have the right opinion. We walked into court day one, and the university settled with us. And we entered into a historic settlement agreement, which for the first time in American history, we had a state institution, the California State University system, which is the umbrella system where many schools are under it, declare as part of its official policy that, quote, Zionism is an integral part of the Jewish identity, end quote. So that anti-Jewish discrimination is not a political issue. It's a civil rights issue, okay? Now, I want to talk about civil rights because really I didn't come here to talk about anti-Semitism. I'm actually really tired of talking about anti-Semitism. It's depressing. We all know it. We're all reading the articles. We're all reading the books about right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, woke anti-Semitism. We know what's happening. So what I want to talk to you today instead about is Jewish unity, Jewish empowerment, and ending Jew hatred in our lifetime. I believe it is possible. I believe that we exist right now at a formative moment in history, especially in this great country, the United States of America, because we are witnessing a seismic shift in identity politics. We have seen with our own eyes the rise of minority rights movements in the 21st century. Being a woman in the workforce is entirely different now than it was 10 years ago when I first started working. Well, a little over 10 years ago. But being black is completely different than it was 6 years ago. And yet, the Jewish community, as I mentioned, the oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history, still has not achieved parity in these minority rights movements. It is still socially acceptable to discriminate against Jewish people. I know that we are in the generation that can change this. And I'm going to tell you why. When I was in the middle of working on the Lawfare Project cases in 2020, COVID had just hit. I was pregnant. I was 8 months pregnant with my third child, and I was living in Brooklyn. And a couple blocks away from me, Black Lives Matter was looting and rioting. I had a cop car lit on fire just a block away from me at Barclays Center. I lived in Fort Greene. And I couldn't walk around my neighborhood. It was not safe because I present as white. And yet, all of my girlfriends and friends who are Zionist Jews who send their kids to Ramaz and all these wonderful schools on the Upper East Side were hashtagging Black Lives Matter, or they were hashtagging Me Too, and they were marching in movements led by racists like Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, because this cognitive dissonance didn't matter when it came to virtue signaling. And it felt good. And Jews always want to participate in other minority rights movements, right? We've participated and been really at the forefront of every single minority rights movement that has ever existed in America. We were front and center for the Black civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. We supported Black Lives Matter. We supported the Me Too movement. We're all about LGBTQIA plus movement. We're all about end Asian hatred because it feels good to advocate for others. But do you know that there's never been a Jews for Jews movement? Never. Do you know in America, and this was so incredible to me, there has never been a Jewish civil rights movement, ever. We had the Zionist movement, which was started 125 years ago by Theodor Herzl. Happy birthday! What a blessed day. Herzl started the Zionist movement, which was a movement for self-sovereignty in our homeland. He wanted to take the Jews out of the countries where they were experiencing discrimination and put them in Israel, where we could live freely. That was a movement for self-sovereignty, Zionism. We also had the Soviet Jewry movement, which lasted a couple years, which was extraordinarily successful, which got hundreds of thousands of people on the street to advocate for Jews elsewhere. To do what? Leave the place that they were experiencing discrimination, and again, come to Israel to live free and proud in the modern Jewish state. But there has never been a Jewish civil rights movement that positions the Jewish person as a minority deserved of equal protection and civil rights here, where we live. Jewish civil rights are not dependent on us leaving and going to Israel. You don't have to be a Zionist to have your civil rights protected. The founding culture of this great country is that we're all equal. So I gave birth, and we funded a study. And I said to myself, I don't understand. I don't understand why I have pro-Israel Zionist Jewish girlfriends on the Upper East Side hashtagging Black Lives Matter. And then actually Israel was also under rocket attack. And I said, I noticed you post this for Black Lives Matter. Can you also post something that's pro-Israel? And they each said, Brooke, I'm sorry, you know where my heart lies, but no, I can't do it. I'm too afraid, it's too political, I'm gonna get, pushback, it's not popular, I don't wanna go there. They wouldn't do it. So I asked myself, the question that we always ask ourselves, why does Israel have such bad PR? What's going on here? So we funded this study, and we spent about 2.5 months doing a deep dive into Black Lives Matter and the New Women's Movement and a bunch of other minority rights movements. And I said, I want to know, what are the strategies? What are the tactics? What is the messaging? What is the organization? What is the funding of successful minority rights movements in the 21st century? And if I replace Black with Jew, could we use those same tactics to advocate for ourselves? And the answer is yes. And we've proven it over the past 2.5 years. Now, if you take anything away from my lecture, and of course, you must take away how wonderful WIZO is. But if you take anything away from what I'm saying today, it should be these 4 points. Because what I want to do is spend the rest of my speech concluding what we learned from this study, so that you can apply these tactics to your civil rights work, so that it should also be successful. The first thing we learned in a 21st century successful minority rights movement, everything is in the name. The name is everything. If you are against Black Lives Matter, regardless of the fact that there's fraud and looting and rioting up and down Madison Avenue, if you're against Black Lives Mattering, you're a racist. If you're against women's rights, you're a misogynist. The way that we describe ourselves is pro-Israel. And what we've done is we've immediately set up a binary. Okay, if I'm pro-Israel, I recognize there's also anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian. And if I'm objective, I need to come in, I need to hear both sides, and I'm going to come out, somewhere in the middle. We tell Jewish students that in order to be Jewish advocates, they have to be pro-Israel advocates. They have to advocate for a foreign state thousands of miles away. They have to memorize a 15-page pamphlet on why Israel is not an apartheid state. They basically have to have a law degree. They have to argue UN Resolution 242, et cetera, et cetera. They have to go into the arena with a shield, not a sword. They have to defend as opposed to go on the offense. This is a losing tactic. I'm not saying, and I want to be very clear, I'm not bashing pro-Israel advocacy. I am a pro-Israel advocate. There is a space, a much-needed space for it. There are many, many wonderful organizations dedicated to pro-Israel advocacy, and they should be successful. But what I'm saying is that it's not moving the needle on anti-Semitism. Dara Horn wrote an incredible book called People Love Dead Jews. And in her book, she argued, it's extraordinarily controversial, that the continued obsession with the Holocaust education and pro-Israel advocacy is actually undermining our cause as a minority rights community. Because what we're doing when somebody attacks a Jew because they're Jewish, like for example, when my former client, Jonathan Carton, was walking across the quad at Columbia University, and he was spat on, and he was called a dirty Zionist baby killer because he's Jewish and because he's Israeli. If we respond to that with pro-Israel advocacy, what we're doing is we're giving them an affirmative defense to discriminate against us. I hate Israel. Therefore, I could turn around and discriminate against you, and you're going to respond with pro-Israel advocacy, right? If I hate China because of China's handling of COVID, I can't go around to a Chinese American, spit on him, call him a dirty COVID spreader. That's racist. Okay, if I'm angry at Iran, I don't go to a Muslim American student and discriminate against him because I hate Iran. That's racist. But it's socially acceptable and okay, and as you saw with the San Francisco State Administration, people buy into this. If you hate Israel, it's okay to transfer, to project that hatred of a foreign country on somebody because of where they were born or because of their religion or how they look. And the more we respond to that with pro-Israel advocacy, the more we feed into that as an affirmative defense. When I went into court, I didn't have to argue with San Francisco State University. Well, really, Zionism is something and Israel is not an apartheid state. That's irrelevant. All I had to say is that my client is discriminated against because he's Jewish. And all I had to do was prove that. There was a black, not Jewish civil rights advocate who came to me one day and she said, I don't understand you guys. If somebody, published a pamphlet saying black men beat their women, I wouldn't reply saying, oh, well, actually only 27% of black men do that. I would accuse them of being racist. and I would go on the offense, and I would make sure that person felt consequences for their hatred. The second thing we learned was that successful civil rights movements speak the language of civil rights. They talk about feelings, not facts. They talk about systemic racism and apartheid and genocide, and use all of these terms and couch themselves in this language. We need to start using this terminology. We need to launch a Jewish civil rights movement that positions Jewish people, again, as deserved of equal protection, regardless of their politics, regardless of where they're born, regardless of what's happening thousands of miles away. The third thing we learned is that these movements are organized very much bottom up. They're grassroots. And actually, I was thinking about it today at the table. WIZO, the reason why WIZO is so successful is because it actually exhibits this particular point. It is a true grassroots movement that goes into communities, that rises up their own leadership. Each WIZO chapter sets their own agenda, okay? Black Lives Matter, I don't know if you guys know this, is 13 years old. They have spent the last 13 years going into communities, training new leaders, going into prisons, creating something where communities can advocate for themselves, and they have the support of leadership. So let's say, for example, a black guy is shot, God forbid, or assaulted in Queens. The next day, the NAACP, Al Sharpton, Farrakhan, all of the leadership will come around that one person, an unrecognizable name, and will stand by him with a unified message, a unified hashtag, and will advocate for that person. If a swastika is painted on a synagogue in the Upper East Side, good luck getting the head of the Federation, the head of the Conference of Presidents, the head of all these organizations. WIZO would come. But good luck getting all of them to come together with a unified message and a singular hashtag. Because we are organized very top down. And that has worked for us. And again, nothing I'm saying is to insult any organizations. But the top-down leadership positions have worked for us until now. So what we're doing, for example, with End Jew Hatred is we go to communities and we create systems where the communities receive financial support, they receive legal support, they receive strategic and tactical support to engage in their own initiatives. And what do these initiatives do? The fourth thing that we learned, and I will conclude with this. The fourth most important thing that a successful civil rights movement can do is ensure consequences for bad behavior. Real consequences. If you're Harvey Weinstein, okay, you're a very bad person, but you're by no means the only male misogynist in the world. And the Me Too movement did not get rid of male misogyny, and Black Lives Matter did not get rid of anti-black racism. But what they did is they made sure there were social, legal, monetary, political consequences. They picked a target, they unified around that target for 2.5 years, and they took that target down. And what they did is they set a precedent, and that precedent has a deterrent effect, that nobody else should behave like that, because look what happened to him. Now, this is also, again, what we do in civil rights litigation. We pick one case, one instance of an issue that is systemic. We set a precedent in a court of law, which then operates as a deterrent. It's very similar, and that's why it's successful. Now, I'm in the pro-Israel advocacy space. I can't even remember who the anti-Semite of the week was two weeks ago. Okay? Was it Roger Waters? Was it this campus? Was it that BDS vote? Was it this UN official? We live in, unfortunately, what they call in the PR world, a target-rich environment. And right when we're finished sending out the email about one anti-Semite, we hear about something else going on. It's indicative, obviously, of the climate we live in, which is incredibly depressing. But if we were able to pick one target, can you imagine if every single Jewish organization worked together and picked one target, how they could make an example of that person? So we launched the End Jew Hatred movement. And I'm happy to say that we have chapters all over the world. There was a 400-person protest in Berlin just a year and a half ago, run by 2 young men who don't have any experience, are not members of any board, are not donors to any foundation, but ended up using the tactics that we taught them to mobilize 400 people in Berlin to protest Jew hatred in Germany. Their protests made the cover of every single major German newspaper, including Der Bild. And a week and a half later, during the German parliamentary elections, the host asked every candidate, "What's your plan to end Jew hatred in Germany?" That was a result of 2 men, 27 years old, using these tactics. We had protests in New York where we gathered people in front of Ben & Jerry's store. We shut the store down because the power of Jews mobilizing on the street is very, very strong. We also were able to protest against Zoom hosting Leila Khaled. We sent 36 activists to Zoom headquarters in San Francisco, where they stood with a sign saying "End Jew Hatred" on Zoom. They were hosting Leila Khaled, who is a leading PFLP terrorist plane hijacker. And we were on the phone with them with legal counsel. And legal counsel said to us, okay, and we watched live as they shut down her feed on Zoom and then on YouTube and then other platforms. They said, okay, now can you get these people out of our parking lot? The last thing that I want to also tell you is one protest that was so significant. When Rose Rich was kicked off the student body, and she is a progressive liberal Jew, but she was a Zionist, so she was kicked off the student committee, whatever it was, at USB. We gathered 4 protesters at the Grove. The Grove is the biggest income-producing property of one of the gentlemen who sat on the board of the school. And they held signs that said "End Jew Hatred" at USB. And the school ended up contacting our activists, and they promised to then enact 8 points that we were able to get the community to tell the school what they need to do to be satisfied that they're dealing with systemic bigotry. The school kept dragging and dragging on. We sent out one email saying, we're thinking of doing a protest outside of Carol Folt's home. The next day, the school adopted all 8 of the recommendations and set up a special committee made of some of the activists to monitor the school. This is the power of Jewish mobilization. And when you mobilize, you will see that our enemies are paper tigers. I promise you, they're cowards. The world is afraid of strong Jews. So empower yourself, unify the community. And the last thing that I've also noticed that I want to mention, I think is really important for this audience. I truly believe the key is women. Women leaders. I have seen so many women in the End Jew Hatred movement become empowered, become activists, set up their own chapters, and engage in direct actions that ensure consequences for Jew hatred. And they've been incredibly, incredibly successful. And I see we have today not 3, but 4 generations of activist women. So I implore you, if you believe in ending Jew hatred, you are part of the movement. It's not a 501c3. It's not an organization. It's an idea. It's a philosophy. Everybody here is part of the movement. And you don't have to shed your affiliation with any organization that you work with. The opposite. The point is to create an umbrella movement that brings all of the Jewish organizations together to agree on one basic common denominator, which is that we can end Jew hatred in our lifetime. Thank you so much for having me. Please take a pin. Please take a pin, a t-shirt, and please go on Amazon and pre-order the book, End Jew Hatred, A Manual for Mobilization. Thank you.
Brooke, stay on stage. Please welcome Lillian Tabasinik, WIZO USA Vice President. The rest I'm going to do on the stage, so I don't need a microphone.
I'm so sorry. My mom reminded me. I can't remember. I forgot this. This is historic. April 29th was declared by over 24 lawmakers. This April 29th was declared by Republican and Democrat lawmakers to be End Jew Hatred Day in America. This is a historical first. There has never been a day officially dedicated in America to fighting anti-Semitism. So that was huge. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Mrs. Goldstein. Happy Mother's Day to you and to everyone here. It's a little early, but this is what this event is. And we have a very special award to give to you, Brooke. It is called the Shomrei Israel Award, because you are a guardian of Israel. You have inspired us today, you have taught us, and I think I can speak for everyone when I say that you are a true Shomrei Israel person. It is actually, it says, we make a living with what, gosh, I didn't bring my glasses. Anyways, I got it. Yes, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. And this is a very special award for me to give to you, because it is the Charlotte and Sammy Rohr Shomrei Israel Award. And these were my parents, Alava Shalom, who were always big advocates of Israel. And thank you for being here
So
today.
grateful. What an honor. Thank you so much. You too. Okay.